When Doug Burgum sued a local blogger for defamation, he expected a quick victory. But he never expected Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to show up in a Fargo courtroom to help argue the case herself. The moment alone courtroom sketch artists, rendering hit social media Crockett mid-objection, pointing towards a slick corporate lawyer. The internet detonated. A muffled audio clip, recorded on a cell phone by the only reporter in the room, captured 4 seconds of her voice, sharp and clear-cutting through legal jargon. Within an hour, #Crockett in court was the top trend on X, rapidly followed by #FreeLeo and #Bully, BURGUM. Cable news producers, who had completely ignored the story of a former governor suing a blogger in North Dakota, scrambled to find pictures of the blogger Leo Schmidt, as their panels, caught completely flat-footed, could only stare, slack-jawed at the viral image of a sitting U.S. Congresswoman defending a citizen journalist against a political titan. In a random state court, the story wasn't just about the lawsuit anymore. It was about the shocking arrival of a gladiator 40-8 hours earlier. The gladiator's opponent saw himself as a pest exterminator. Doug Burgum sat in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of his private equity firm's Fargo headquarters, the morning sun glinting off the polished chrome and steel that framed a panoramic view of the city he once governed. He swirled the last of an espresso in a small ceramic cup and listened to his lead attorney, Alan Devlin, on speakerphone. The kid's local counsel filed a motion to dismiss this morning. Devlin's voice, smooth as worn leather, crackled from the phone. It's boilerplate, cites the First Amendment, public interest, the usual nonsense. It has no teeth, Doug. North Dakota's anti-LAPP statute is a feather duster, not a hammer. Burgum stared out the window, watching tiny cars move silently below. Good, he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum of satisfaction. I don't want it dismissed. I want discovery. I want to see his emails, his texts, his sources. Who are we kidding? He doesn't have sources. I want to bankrupt him with billable hours. Make him understand that actions have consequences. This wasn't about winning a judgment. The blogger Leo Schmidt, a 24-year-old who ran a WordPress site called the Prairie Post, probably didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. This was about incapacitation. It was a business transaction where the currency was intimidation and the desired outcome was absolute silence. His blog posts are an annoyance, Alan Burgum continued, placing the cup down with a decisive click. He's sniffing around the Dakota Sovereign Fund's infrastructure investments. He's asking questions about the Azure Prairie Fire data center contracts. They're dumb questions, but they're annoying. He's implying a conflict of interest, because my firm advised on the capital stack. It's meritless, but it creates a headline for my opponents. We've categorized 57 distinct statements in his last 3 posts that we are claiming are defamatory, Devlin said. The sheer volume of the complaint is designed to overwhelm his lawyer. Public record shows he mostly handles DUS and divorces. He's completely out of his depth. Perfect, Burgum said. A thin smile touched his lips. He envisioned the blogger, some pale, anxious kid, hunched over a glowing screen in his parents' basement, suddenly faced with a 200-page lawsuit from one of the most expensive law firms in the Midwest. The lawsuit wasn't a legal instrument. It was a psychological weapon. It was a message sent not just to Leo Schmidt, but to anyone else who might get curious about the seamless, profitable synergy between his past public service and his current private ventures. Let's make an example of him. No settlement offers, no off-ramps, full court press. This is a business decision. The cost of this lawsuit is an investment in future silence. Almost 1,000 miles away, in a cluttered office in the Rayburn House office building, Jasmine Crockett was scrolling through a different kind of business decision on her laptop. It was nearly 10 p.m. in Washington, D.C., the Capitol dome glowing outside her window, and her desk was a chaotic landscape of briefing books, hearing transcripts, and empty coffee cups. Her legislative director, a sharp, perpetually tired woman named Maya, had forwarded her an email an hour ago. It was from a digital rights advocacy group under the subject line, Urgent. Former governor attempts to silence. Journalist with frivolous slapsuit in end. Crockett, a former public defender, had a finely tuned antenna for this kind of fight. It wasn't the celebrity or the party that mattered. It was the power imbalance. She clicked the link to Leo Schmidt's blog, the Prairie Post, the site. was stark, simple, and utterly unadorned. There were no ads, no pop-ups, just black text on a white background. She started reading. The posts weren't slick. The prose was a little dense, occasionally clumsy, but it was meticulously researched. Schmidt had spent weeks filing public records requests, cross-referencing corporate filings, and tracking the flow of funds from a state-managed investment portfolio into projects that, time and again, had some connection, however tangential, to Doug Burgum's post-gubernatorial career. He wasn't alleging crimes, he was pointing out connections and asking questions. He was doing the fundamental, tedious work of local accountability journalism. She read one of Leo's questions aloud to the empty office. Why did the Dakota Sovereign Fund, using public employee pension funds, invest $200 million in a private data center project? Only after the project's primary contractor hired a consulting firm where former Governor Burgum is a senior advisor. That's not defamation, she muttered to herself. That's a goddamn good question. She pulled up the lawsuit Devlin had described with such pride. It was, as he'd said, a masterpiece of overwhelming force. A legal battering, ram designed to pulverize, not persuade. She saw the strategy immediately. It wasn't about proving libel. It was about making the process the punishment. They would bury Leo Schmidt in depositions, subpoenas, and motions until he either retracted everything and apologized or simply vanished under the weight of it all. Her mind shifted from legislator back to lawyer. She pulled up Westlaw on her computer and started reading. North Dakota's statutes on strategic lawsuits against public participation. Burgum's lawyer was right. The law was toothless. It offered none of the protections journalists and citizens in other states had. No mechanism to quickly dismiss a retaliatory suit and force the plaintiff to pay the defendant's legal fees. Leo Schmidt was exposed. A quiet anger, cool and sharp, began to build in her chest. This was the stuff that drove her crazy. It was the same dynamic she saw in courtrooms back in Texas, where a wealthy landlord could evict a family with a blizzard of paperwork the family couldn't hope to understand, let alone fight. It was the same principle, just scaled up, with a former governor using his fortune like a club. She looked at her calendar for the next 2 days. A subcommittee hearing on agricultural policy, a caucus meeting. Nothing that couldn't be moved. Nothing as important as this. She picked up her phone and made a call. Maya, it's me. I know it's late. I need you to get me everything you can on a North Dakota lawyer named Ben Carter. Yes, the one representing Leo Schmidt. And I need to know the requirements for pro-hack vice admission to the North Dakota bar for an out-of-state attorney. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Congresswoman, what are you thinking? I'm thinking Crockett, said, her eyes fixed on Leo Schmidt's earnest, worried face in his blog's author photo, that this kid needs a better lawyer. And I'm thinking, I'm a licensed attorney in good standing with the Texas State Bar. Book me a commercial flight to Fargo tomorrow morning, the earliest one you can find. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a duty. The Cass County District courtroom was a study in beige and cheap wood paneling. Leo Schmidt sat beside his lawyer, Ben Carter, at the defendant's table, feeling like a microbe under a microscope. Ben was a good man, a decent man, who had taken the case pro bono because no one else would, but he looked as terrified as Leo felt. His worn suit jacket seemed a size too big, and his notes were scribbled on a yellow legal pad that shook slightly in his hand. Across the aisle, it was a different world. Alan Devlin and 2 other lawyers from his firm sat ramrod straight in. Their $1,000 suits, an intimidating row of bespoke shoulders and confident smirks. Their table was covered in neatly tabbed binders and sleek laptops. They looked like they owned the room. They looked like they owned the law. The preliminary hearing was on their motion to compel discovery. It was the first step in their strategy of annihilation. Judge Ann Weyer, a woman in her late 60s with a reputation for sharp intellect and zero patience for theatrics, presided from the bench. Then, 10 minutes before the hearing was set to begin, the courtroom door opened quietly. Jasmine Crockett walked in. She wore a simple, dark gray pantsuit, her hair pulled back professionally. She wasn't dressed for a rally. She was dressed for work. She carried a single leather briefcase. She walked directly to the defendant's table, leaned down, and spoke. In a low voice to Ben Carter, Leo watched, his heart pounding, as Ben's eyes went wide with disbelief. He looked from Crockett to Leo and back again, his mouth slightly agape. Across the aisle, Alan Devlin watched the exchange with a flicker of annoyance. Assuming she was some DC activist there for a photo op, he leaned over to one of his junior associates. "Find out who that is," he whispered. A moment later, Ben Carter, looking dazed, stood up. "Your Honor, before we begin, the defense would like to make a motion to admit Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of the Texas State Bar pro hack vice for the purpose of assisting in this case." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His associate, who had just gotten the result on his phone, stared at him in horror. Judge Weyer looked down from the bench, her expression unreadable. She looked at Crockett, who stood calmly, meeting her gaze. "Is that so, Mr. Carter?" the judge said, her voice dry. "And does the Congresswoman have her paperwork in order?" "Do, Your Honor," Crockett said, stepping forward and placing a prepared motion and a certificate of good standing from the Texas Bar. On the clerk's desk, Devlin shot to his feet. "Your Honor," plaintiff objects, "this is a transparent and pathetic attempt to turn this serious legal proceeding into a political circus, a publicity stunt. Congresswoman Crockett has no connection to this case, no connection to North Dakota. Her presence here is solely to intimidate the plaintiff and grandstand for a national audience." Judge Weyer held up a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Devlin. Your objection is noted and, for the moment, overruled. I have reviewed her motion. She is a licensed attorney in good standing. This is a North Dakota courtroom, not the U.S. Congress. Here, she is an attorney, and I will treat her as such. If she starts grandstanding, I will deal with it then." Motion granted. "Welcome to my courtroom, counselor. Try not to make me regret it." Crockett gave a slight, respectful nod. "Thank you, Your Honor. I will not." She sat down next to Leo, giving his shoulder a firm, reassuring squeeze. For the first time in weeks, Leo felt a tiny flicker of something other than pure terror. Devlin, seething but professional, launched into his opening argument for the discovery motion. He was smooth, articulate, and utterly merciless. "Your Honor," he began, his voice resonating with rehearsed sincerity. "Mr. Burgum has dedicated his life to public service and private enterprise, building this state's economy and its profile. His reputation for integrity is unassailable, and that reputation has been maliciously attacked by the defendant, Mr. Schmidt." He gestured dismissively toward Leo. "Let us be clear about who the defendant is. He is not a journalist. He is not a reporter. He holds no degree in journalism. He is not a member of any professional journalistic organization. He is a blogger. He is a man with an internet connection and an agenda. He is, to put it plainly, a clout-chasing kid with a laptop." The phrase hung in the air, dripping with contempt. Leo felt his face burn with humiliation. Devlin continued, pacing slowly before the judge. He published these defamatory articles with a reckless disregard for the truth. He accuses a man of unimpeachable character of corruption, of conflicts of interest, all without a single shred of credible evidence. He hides behind the shield of asking questions, when his intent is not to find answers, but to create a false narrative for his own political and personal aggrandizement. We are here today to ask for the tools to prove that malice. We need his notes, his emails, his text messages. We need to know who he spoke to, who fed him these lies. The First Amendment, Your Honor, is a shield for the press. It is not a sword for slanderers. We ask the court to grant our motion to compel so that we may begin the process of repairing the damage this reckless young man has caused. Down a portrait of righteous indignation. The room was still. Ben Carter looked at his legal pad, then at Crockett, looking utterly lost. He cleared his throat to speak, but Crockett placed a gentle hand on his arm. She gave him a small nod, then rose to her feet. The courtroom's focus shifted entirely to her. She was not loud or theatrical. She stood straight, her hands resting on the edge of the table, and her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured, and cut through the tension like a razor. "Honor," she began, her eyes locked on Judge Weyer. "Mr. Devlin is correct about one thing. This case is about malice." She paused for a beat, letting the word hang in the courtroom, then shifted her gaze deliberately from the judge to Alan Devlin. "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims malice, but the malice here isn't in Leo Schmidt's reporting. It's in the lawsuit itself. This is a multimillionaire former governor using his fortune to silence a citizen for doing the journalism. The local paper was too intimidated to do. The only malice in this room is Mr. Burgum's attempt to bully a 24-year-old into silence for printing the truth. Devlin jumped to his feet. Objection. Counsel is testifying. She is mischaracterizing my client's intent and turning this into a personal attack. Mr. Devlin, Judge Weyer said, her voice dangerously calm. You yourself characterized the defendant as a clout-chasing kid. The door to discussing intent and characterization appears to be wide open. Sit down. I want to hear the rest of Counselor Crockett's argument. Devlin sat, his face a mask of controlled fury. Crockett gave the judge a brief nod of gratitude and turned her attention back to the core of the matter. Mr. Devlin claims my client is not a journalist. Why? Because he doesn't have a specific degree. Because he doesn't work for a legacy newspaper. The last time I checked, the First Amendment protects speech, not professional guilds. In an era where local newspapers are being gutted and sold for parts by hedge funds, who is left to hold local power accountable? Often, it is citizens like Leo Schmidt. Citizens who spend their nights and weekends poring over public documents because they believe the public has a right to know how their money, their pension funds, their tax dollars is being spent. She picked up a thin folder from the table. Mr. Devlin claims there is not a shred of credible evidence for Mr. Schmidt's questions. That is demonstrably false. She opened the folder. Mr. Schmidt's first question, which Mr. Burgum's lawsuit labels Defamatory Statement 1A, asks why a state contract for the Azure Prairie Fire Data Center was awarded to a specific construction firm. The lawsuit claims this implies cronyism, but Mr. Schmidt's question was based on this. She held up a document, the state's own bid summary report, obtained via a public records request, which shows the winning bid was 12% higher than the next lowest competitor. A fact. She placed it down and held up another. His second post, which contains defamatory statement to be, questions the sale of 300 acres of state-owned land to a development group. Mr. Schmidt points out that the group's primary investor is a holding company that, according to SEC filings I have right here, counts Mr. Burgum's own private equity firm as a minority partner. A fact, she continued, piece by piece, not like a politician giving a speech, but like a lawyer building a case. She took grand, sweeping accusations of slander and dismantled them with a methodical barrage of small, verifiable facts. She showed that every question Leo had posed in his blog was predicated on a public document, a corporate filing, or a statement made in a public meeting. Your Honor, she said, her voice resonating with a new intensity. The plaintiff's motion to compel discovery before this court rules on our motion to dismiss is a perversion of the legal process. They want to punish Mr. Schmidt for his questions by forcing him to expose his every communication. Not to find evidence of malice, but to intimidate anyone who might have spoken with him. To grant this motion would be to validate the core tactic of the slap suit to make the process itself the penalty. It would send a message to every citizen in North Dakota that if you ask powerful people uncomfortable questions, you'd better be prepared to have your entire life examined under a microscope by a team of corporate lawyers. She's twisting the law, Devlin interjected, unable to restrain himself. I am stating its purpose, Mr. Devlin, Crockett shot back without looking at him, her focus remaining on the judge. The First Amendment was written to protect the Leo Schmidts of the world from the Doug Burgums of the world. It was written so that a citizen with a laptop can question a powerful man, and not have to be a millionaire himself to withstand the legal onslaught that follows. Mr. Burgum is a public figure. The legal standard for proving defamation against a public figure is actual malice, that Mr. Schmidt knew his statements were false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. Every document in this folder shows the opposite. It shows painstaking care. It shows a young man trying to connect the dots that no one else was. She closed the folder. My client has nothing to hide, Your Honor, but he will not be bullied. We ask that you deny the plaintiff's motion to compel. Let them argue the merits of their case based on the public record. Let them prove that Mr. Schmidt's questions, based entirely on public documents, were somehow maliciously false. They cannot, because they are not. First, rule on our motion to dismiss this frivolous and retaliatory lawsuit. Do not give the plaintiff the satisfaction of punishing a citizen for exercising his constitutional rights. She sat down. The courtroom was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It was charged, heavy with the weight of her argument. Leo looked at her, his vision blurry with unshed tears. He had spent weeks feeling small, stupid, and reckless. In the space of 10 minutes, she had made him feel like he was the one holding the line. Judge Ware looked at Crockett, then at Devlin. She took off her reading glasses and tapped them on the bench. "Mr. Devlin," she said, her tone leaving. "No room for argument. Your client is a former governor and a major player in national business and politics. He is, by any conceivable definition, a public figure. The statements published by Mr. Schmidt on his blog pertain to matters of significant public concern, namely, the use of public funds and potential conflicts of interest involving a prominent public figure. The standard is, indeed, actual malice." She paused, looking directly at Devlin's stony face. The plaintiff's motion to compel broad discovery at this stage of the proceedings, before the court has had the opportunity to even hear arguments on the defendant's motion to dismiss, feels premature. More than that, it feels punitive. The purpose of this state's anti-SLAPP statute, however weak it may be, is to prevent the use of litigation as a cudgel to silence public discourse. To grant your motion now would be to hand your client that cudgel. She picked up her gavel. Therefore, the plaintiff's motion to compel discovery is denied. We will schedule a hearing on the defendant's motion to dismiss for next month. I suggest you both come prepared to argue the finer points of New York Times v. Sullivan. With a single sharp crack of the gavel, she concluded, "We are adjourned." For a second, nobody moved. Alan Devlin's face was a thundercloud of disbelief. His entire strategy to bleed Leo dry, to crush him with process, had just been stonewalled. He snapped his briefcase shut with a vicious flick of his wrist. Across the aisle, Ben Carter stared at Crockett, his mouth hanging open, as if he'd just witnessed an act of divine intervention. Leo finally let the tears fall, wiping them away hastily with the sleeve of his worn blazer. Jasmine Crockett simply gathered her papers, placed them in her briefcase, and gave Leo's shoulder another firm squeeze. "One round at a time," she whispered. The victory wasn't final, but it was total. She had beaten them not with politics, but with the law. The exit from the courthouse was a jarring transition from the cloistered quiet of the courtroom to a sudden, chaotic media scrum. The single local reporter had apparently tipped off his entire network. Now, a half-dozen cameras and a score of microphones were being shoved towards the courthouse doors. As Crockett, Leo, and Ben emerged, they were engulfed in a blaze of flashing lights and shouted questions. "Congresswoman, why are you here? Leo, how does it feel? Are you calling the former governor a bully?" Crockett stepped in front of Leo, shielding him from the worst of the onslaught. She raised a hand, and the shouting subsided slightly. "Today, a judge in Fargo, North Dakota, affirmed a core American principle," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The First Amendment isn't just for powerful media corporations. It's for every single citizen. It's a shield for people like Leo Schmidt, who have the courage to ask tough questions of powerful people. We are pleased the court denied the plaintiff's attempt to bully a young journalist, and we look forward to having this entire baseless lawsuit dismissed." She kept it short, powerful, and on point. Before anyone could ask a follow-up, she guided Leo and Ben through the crowd to a waiting sedan she had arranged. As they pulled away, Leo's phone buzzed, and buzzed again and again. His blog, which usually got a few hundred hits a day, had crashed from the traffic. His name, once unknown, was now the subject of a national news story. The courtroom sketch of Crockett pointing at Devlin was the new symbol of the fight, a meme being remixed and shared millions of times. On CNN, a panel was already debating the implications. A conservative commentator was accusing Crockett of an unethical abuse of her office, while a liberal one was hailing her as a hero of the people. Burgum's office had released a blistering statement accusing her of mob justice and political theater. The story had gone nuclear. Later that evening, in a nondescript Marriott hotel room overlooking a Fargo parking lot, the adrenaline finally receded, leaving Jasmine Crockett with a familiar, bone-deep exhaustion. The glow of victory had been replaced by the relentless ping of her phone. Texts from the House Democratic leadership, some congratulatory, nervous emails from every cable news booker in the country. But it was the other noise, the digital sewage flowing into her social media mentions, that she forced herself to read. The threats were vile and graphic. Racist, misogynistic tirades, doctored photos, vows to show up at her home in Texas. At her office in D.C., her chief of staff messaged her that the D.C. office was being flooded with calls, some so vulgar and threatening that they'd had to put the new interns on a different task. This was the predictable, ugly cost of poking the bear. She silenced her phone and sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the hotel room suddenly feeling immense. She knew she should feel triumphant, but mostly she just felt weary. It was one thing to fight in the structured arena of a congressional committee, another to parachute into a local fight and ignite a national firestorm. Her personal phone rang. Displaying a picture of her mother, she took a deep breath and answered. Forcing a lightness into her voice she didn't feel. "Hey Mama, Jasmine, what have you gotten yourself into now?" Her mother's voice was stripped of all pleasantries, tight with worry. "I saw you on the news. They're showing that drawing of you in that courtroom. Your father is pacing a hole in the carpet. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mama. We won the motion. It was a good day." "I'm not talking about the motion, and you know it," her mother retorted. "I'm talking about that man, that governor. I read what they're saying about you online. The things they're calling you, baby. Is it worth it? Stirring up all this hate, all this ugliness, for some boy you don't even know in North Dakota." The question landed with a heavy thud in the quiet room. It was the question she'd have to answer, not just for her mother, but for herself. Over and over again, she looked out the window at the dark, flat landscape. "Mama," she said, her voice now quiet and serious. "When I was a public defender, I had a client, a woman named Maria. She was being evicted. The landlord had a fancy lawyer, and she had me. We were in court, and his lawyer just buried us in paperwork, in lies, really, and I watched the judge just accept it because it was easier. I lost, and a month later, I saw Maria and her 2 kids on the street. I never forgot that feeling. The feeling that the whole system is tilted, and if someone with a little bit of power doesn't try to put their thumb on the other side of the scale, the little guy doesn't just lose, he gets crushed." She paused, swallowing hard. "That kid, Leo, he's Maria. And that governor, with his money and his army of lawyers, he's the landlord. So, yes, it's worth it. It has to be." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was softer. "You be safe, you hear me? Your father and I, we're proud of you. But you be safe." "I will, Mama. I love you." She hung up the phone and stared at her reflection in the dark window. The exhaustion was still there, a lead weight in her limbs. But beneath it, her mother's question had forged something harder in its place: resolve. The fight was just beginning. The week following the hearing was a masterclass in narrative warfare. Doug Burgum's camp, momentarily stunned, recovered. With the brutal efficiency of a corporate turnaround, Alan Devlin became a fixture on conservative media, his handsome, concerned face projected onto millions of screens. He never looked angry. He looked wounded, disappointed, and above all, reasonable. On a primetime Fox News show, he spoke in sorrowful tones to a sympathetic host. "What we witnessed in that Fargo courtroom was not justice," Devlin said, shaking his head slightly. "A radical out-of-state politician seeking to elevate her national profile. Congresswoman Crockett flew 1,000 miles not to defend a constituent, not to uphold the law, but to pour gasoline on a fire she hoped would burnish her brand." Mr. Burgum filed this suit reluctantly, as a last resort, to protect his name he has spent a lifetime building with integrity and service to North Dakota from baseless smears, published by a young man who has mistaken conspiracy theories for journalism. The host nodded gravely. "And Alan, it's fair to say this blogger, this Mr. Schmidt, is being used as a pawn by the Congresswoman, isn't he?" "Tragically, yes," Devlin agreed. "She has turned this young man's life into a political circus. Mr. Burgum simply wants the truth to come out. All Congresswoman Crockett wants is a headline. It's a profound disservice to the people of North Dakota and an assault on the principle that our courtrooms should be free from political intimidation." The message was clear, consistent, and effective. To half the country, Doug Burgum was, now the victim, a respected public servant besieged by a partisan mob, and Jasmine Crockett was a meddling opportunist. For Leo Schmidt, the subject of this national debate, the experience was disorienting, like being the main character in a movie he was watching from the audience. He sat with Ben Carter in the older lawyer's modest office, the smell of stale coffee and old case files a familiar comfort in a world turned upside down. On the screen of Ben's computer, they watched the GoFundMe page Ben had created 2 weeks ago, titled simply, Leo Schmidt's First Amendment Defense Fund. The goal had been a hopeful $10,000 to cover initial costs. The current total was climbing past $432,000. "I've never seen anything like it," Ben murmured, staring at the number. Donations from every state. A retired teacher in Ohio sent $20. A tech guy in California sent $5,000. They're leaving comments. "Thank you for fighting. Don't let the bully win." Leo felt a dizzying mix of gratitude and crushing pressure. "Ben, what do we even do with all that?" "First, we put it in a trust," Ben said, suddenly all business. "Second, we hire a forensic accounting firm. Devlin's entire case against you is that you're reckless. Your case for dismissal rests on the fact that you're careful." Congresswoman Crockett laid out the roadmap. "Now, we follow it. We're going to get an independent third-party analysis of every single document you based your articles on. We're going to build a mountain of evidence so high that their claim of malice looks ridiculous, even from the summit." A week ago, Leo was a solitary researcher, fueled by lukewarm coffee and civic outrage. Now he was the public face of a movement, a symbol. Strangers stopped him at the grocery store. Some would grip his arm and whisper, "Keep going, son. We're with you." Others would drive by and yell, "Liar." From their pickup trucks, he felt energized by the support, but haunted by the responsibility. He couldn't shake the image of Crockett in that courtroom, putting her own reputation on the line for him. He couldn't let her down. He spent his days now not just writing, but working with Ben, documenting every step of his research, preparing for the fight of his life with a sense of purpose that dwarfed his fear. The public narrative remained locked. In this partisan 50-50 split for 2 weeks, it was Crockett the hero versus Crockett the villain. Burgum the bully versus Burgum the victim. The truth of the case itself was lost in the political noise. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the entire landscape shifted. The change came not from a politician or a pundit, but from a voice of almost mythic journalistic authority. Julian Pace was 78 years old, a living legend of investigative reporting. He had won 2 Pulitzers, his byline synonymous with the kind of deep, impartial, shoe-leather journalism that had exposed corporate and government corruption for 5 decades. He was a political independent, a man who had been equally withering in his criticism of Republican and Democratic administrations. He wrote an occasional widely read column for The Atlantic, a perch from which he issued pronouncements on the state of American media and democracy. Like a venerated oracle, his column that Tuesday was titled, "The Lawsuit That Should Scare Every American." He began not with Crockett or Burgum, but with Leo Schmidt. "I have never met Leo Schmidt," Pace wrote. "I had not, until 2 weeks ago, ever read his blog, The Prairie Post, but in the wake of the furor surrounding former Governor Doug Burgum's defamation lawsuit against him, I and my small team of researchers have done what any journalist should. We read the work. We pulled the public documents, the state bid summaries, the SEC filings, the minutes of the state investment board meetings that formed the basis of Mr. Schmidt's reporting. Our conclusion is unequivocal. The questions Mr. Schmidt asks in his posts are not the product of malice or recklessness. They are the product of diligence. They are the reasonable, logical, and vital questions that arise from a careful reading of the public record. The column was a quiet earthquake. Pace went on to dismantle the talking points from Burgum's camp, not with rhetoric, but with cold, hard analysis. The lawsuit against Mr. Schmidt is a textbook example of a strategic lawsuit against public participation, or SLAP, he explained. These suits are not filed to be won. They are filed to intimidate. They leverage the vast financial and legal resources of the powerful to silence the less powerful. The goal is to make the act of asking a question so financially and emotionally ruinous that no one will dare to ask again. When a former governor sues a citizen journalist for doing basic factual research into how public money is being spent, that is not a defense of reputation. It is an attack on the very foundation of public accountability. The most devastating blow came in his final paragraphs. "I have my share of policy disagreements with Congresswoman Crockett," Pace wrote, a sentence that immediately neutralized any accusation of partisan bias. But her actions in that Fargo courtroom were not, as some have claimed, an attack on the rule of law. They were a defense of it. She recognized a gross power imbalance that threatened to extinguish a citizen's fundamental right to inquire, and she used her skills as a lawyer to help level the playing field. The issue here is not her politics. It is the principle that justice cannot be the exclusive property of the wealthy. Leo Schmidt's blog may not be the Washington Post, but his work stands in the finest tradition of American journalism, that of an ordinary citizen, armed with the facts, speaking truth, to power. To allow him to be silenced by this lawsuit would be a loss for us all. The column landed with the force of a papal encyclical. It completely reframed the conversation. It was no longer a story about a Democratic congresswoman attacking a Republican figure. It was now a story about free speech, about the First Amendment, about the public's right to know. Mainstream news outlets, which had been timidly covering the political angle, now felt they had the institutional cover to delve into the merits of the case itself. Legal analysts appeared on MSNBC and CNN, citing Pace's column and explaining the dangers of slapsuits. Even some moderate conservative commentators, the kind who revered journalistic icons like Pace, began to publicly state their discomfort with Burgum's strategy. The shift was palpable. Alan Devlin's media appearances became less frequent. The narrative he had so carefully crafted was crumbling under the weight of Julian Pace's credibility. The story had found its moral center, and it was not on the side of the former governor. The tidal wave of new coverage culminated in a call to Jasmine Crockett's office from a producer at PBS's flagship news program, Frontline. They were doing an hour-long special on the case, slapsuits, and the decline of local journalism. They wanted a definitive, long-form interview, not a 2-minute cable news hit, but a deep, thoughtful conversation. Crockett's chief of staff, Maya, heard the request. "This is it," Maya said. "This isn't a food fight with a partisan host. This is the big one. It's a chance to define what this fight was about, on your own terms, for the history books." Crockett looked at the email from the Frontline producer. The interview would be with their most respected correspondent, a woman known for her tough but scrupulously fair questioning. There would be no interruptions, no shouting matches. Just her, a camera, and the unvarnished truth of why she went to Fargo. This was the platform she had been waiting for. It was the chance to elevate the argument from a single courtroom battle to the larger principle that drove her. She knew Burgum's camp would either refuse to participate or send a spokesperson to spin. This was her opportunity to deliver the final defining word. "Tell them yes," Crockett said, a quiet sense of purpose settling over her. "Book it." The Frontline interview took place not in the political theater of Washington, D.C., but in the quiet, book-lined reading room of a public library in Dallas, in the heart of Jasmine Crockett's district. The choice of location was deliberate, designed to frame her as a public servant and an officer of the court, not just a politician. The interviewer was Sarah Pike, a journalist whose calm demeanor belied a famously sharp, forensic questioning style. The cameras were rolling. "Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for being here," Pike began. "Let's start with the column by Julian Pace in The Atlantic. He called your actions in that Fargo courtroom a defense of the rule of law. Your critics, including former Governor Burgum's legal team, have called it political theater and an assault on the judiciary." Which was it? Crockett met her gaze without blinking. "It was lawyering, Ms. Pike. Before I was a congresswoman, I was a public defender. I spent years in courtrooms, standing next to people who had the full weight of the system bearing down on them. They didn't have power, they didn't have money, and often they didn't have a voice. My job was to be that voice. What I saw in Leo Schmidt's case was the same dynamic, just with a different set of players. It was a multimillionaire, a former governor with a team of high-priced corporate lawyers, using his power to crush a 24-year-old citizen who dared to ask questions. To me, that wasn't a political issue. It was a justice issue. So, I did what lawyers are supposed to do. I showed up for my client." Pike nodded, consulting her notes. "Let's talk about that." Your critics point to your fiery exchanges in congressional hearings and say, you are, by nature, a partisan fighter. They argue that you cannot simply take off your political hat and put on a lawyer's hat. How do you respond to the charge that you brought the partisan rancor of Washington, D.C. into a state courtroom that should have been insulated from it? I'd argue that Mr. Burgum brought the power imbalance into that courtroom long before I got on a plane. Crockett countered smoothly. The partisanship wasn't me showing up. The partisanship was in the belief that a powerful man of one party could use the courts to silence a critic without consequence. My politics are informed by my legal background, not the other way around. My core political belief is that the system should be fair, that the rules should apply to everyone, regardless of their bank account or their title. When I see a system being rigged, whether it's through a bad piece of legislation in Congress or a frivolous lawsuit in a Fargo courtroom, I believe it is my duty both as a legislator and as a lawyer to fight it. The goal isn't a partisan win. The goal is a level playing field. Pike leaned forward slightly. This fight has come at a personal cost. Your office has been inundated with threats. Your family has expressed their worry. A question, my viewers, would have a question I think many people have, is the one your own mother asked you, was it worth it? The ugliness, the vitriol, the threats. For one blogger in North Dakota, this was the question, the one that cut through the legal and political strategy and went straight to the heart of the matter. Crockett paused, and for the first time, a flicker of the weariness she'd felt in that Fargo hotel room showed in her eyes. But her voice, when she answered, was firm. Yes, she said simply, it was worth it, because this was never just about one blogger. It's about the next one, and the one after that. We are developing what I call accountability deserts in this country. Places where local news has dried up, where there's no one left to go to the city council meeting, to read the boring state budget, to ask the tough questions. And into that void, people like Leo Schmidt are stepping up. Citizen journalists, bloggers, ordinary people trying to keep power in check. She looked directly into the camera lens, no longer just speaking to Sarah Pike, but to the millions who would be watching. This was her moment to define the principle. And what is the response from some of those in power? To sue them into silence. SLAPP suits are not about justice. They are a tool of censorship, wielded by the wealthy to bully their critics into submission. It's a threat not just to the First Amendment, but to the very idea of a government of, by, and for the people. Because if citizens are too afraid to ask questions, democracy withers. The law is supposed to be a shield for people like Leo Schmidt. What Mr. Burgum tried to do was turn it into a sword. And if a lawyer, any lawyer who has the ability to stand up and say, no, not on my watch, doesn't do it, then the whole system breaks down. She took a breath, her voice filled with a quiet, controlled passion. So yes, it was worth it. The threats are ugly. But the alternative, a country where the powerful are unaccountable and citizens are afraid to speak, much uglier. I didn't go to Fargo to become a headline. I went to hold a shield for a kid who was standing his ground, and I would do it again tomorrow. The interview was the centerpiece of the Frontline episode. It aired on a Tuesday night. The final 5 minutes of the program were devastatingly effective. Over images of shuttered small-town newspaper offices and graphics showing the decline in local reporting. Sarah Pike's voiceover narrated the rise of SLAPP suits as a national phenomenon. The episode ended with a photo of a smiling Leo Schmidt, followed by a black screen with simple white text, Doug Burgum and his attorney Alan Devlin. Devlin declined multiple requests to be interviewed for this program. That silent refusal spoke volumes, a de facto admission that they had no credible public argument left to make. 1 month after Jasmine Crockett first walked into that Fargo courtroom, the hearing on the defense's motion to dismiss was held. The atmosphere could not have been more different. The beige anonymous courtroom was now the hottest ticket in the state. Every seat was filled. The press section overflowed with national media. C-SPAN cameras had been permitted to broadcast the proceedings. Alan Devlin, when he rose to speak, was a changed man. His swagger was gone, replaced by the rigid posture of a man going through the motions. His arguments were technical, dry, and delivered without conviction. He cited case law and procedural rules, avoiding any mention of clout-chasing kids or grand statements about his client's reputation. He was a lawyer, trying to salvage some professional credibility from the wreckage of a failed strategy. His argument was met with a heavy, unimpressed silence. Then, Ben Carter rose for the defense. He stood taller than he had a month before. His suit seemed to fit him better. He held a new sense of quiet authority. He had spent the last month working side by side with Crockett and a team of pro bono, First Amendment specialists a national organization had provided. Crockett sat beside him at the defendant's table, not as the lead, but as co-counsel, a partner. She had given him the confidence. Now she was letting him lead the charge. Ben's argument was clear, concise, and powerful. He walked Judge Weyer through the mountain of evidence. They had compiled the binder of public documents, the forensic analysis confirming Leo's timeline, the affidavits from journalism professors praising the meticulous nature of Leo's research. He concluded with a simple, powerful plea. Your Honor, the plaintiff has not provided a single piece of evidence that Mr. Schmidt acted with malice. Not one. They have only proven that they did not like the questions he was asking. In America, that is not grounds for a lawsuit. It is grounds for a public debate. We ask you to dismiss this case, to send a clear message that our courts are not tools for the powerful to silence the press. Whether that press is the New York Times or a young man with a laptop in Fargo, North Dakota. Ben sat down. Crockett gave him a subtle, approving nod. Judge Weyer looked out over the packed courtroom. She had listened intently to both sides. She took a sip of water, then began to speak. I have thoroughly reviewed the motion to dismiss, the plaintiff's response, and the extensive documentary evidence provided by the defense, she began, her voice commanding the full attention of the room. The standard here is clear. As a public figure, Mr. Burgum must demonstrate that Mr. Schmidt acted with actual malice. He has failed to do so. On a careful and diligent analysis of public records, she looked down at Alan Devlin. This court is forced to agree with the assessment of many legal scholars and veteran journalists, including Mr. Julian Pace, whose column was submitted. As an exhibit, this lawsuit has all the hallmarks of a slap suit. Its primary purpose appears not to be the legitimate redress of reputational harm, but the chilling of legitimate public discourse and the punishment of a critic through litigation. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Therefore, Judge Weyer announced, her voice ringing with finality, the defendant's motion is granted. This case is dismissed with prejudice. A wave of relief and quiet celebration erupted at the defense table. Leo Schmidt sagged in his chair, covering his face with his hands as tears of pure relief streamed down his face. Ben Carter put a hand on his back, his own eyes shining. Jasmine Crockett closed her eyes for a brief moment, a long, deep breath her only celebration. But the judge wasn't finished. She held up a hand for silence. Furthermore, she said, her gaze now ice-cold and fixed on the plaintiff's table, this court finds that the initial complaint was frivolous and filed for an improper purpose, namely to harass the defendant and stifle free speech, pursuant to Rule 11 of the North Dakota Rules of Civil Procedure. This court is imposing sanctions on the plaintiff's law firm. You will be responsible for all reasonable attorney's fees and costs incurred by the defendant in this matter. A citizen's defense of his First Amendment rights should not have to be crowdfunded when that defense is necessitated by another's abuse of the legal system. The gavel came down with a thunderous crack. It was over. A total, unambiguous victory. Alan Devlin and his team sat frozen for a moment, stunned into immobility by the final humiliating rebuke. Then, wordlessly, they began to pack their expensive briefcases, their faces grim masks of defeat. Justice, in this courtroom, had been tilted back. Outside the courthouse, the scene was one of controlled pandemonium. The crowd was 3 times larger than it had been for the preliminary hearing, a mix of national media, local supporters holding handmade signs, and curious onlookers. This time, there was a podium and a microphone, set up by Ben Carter's newly confident office. He approached it first, adjusting the microphone with a steady hand that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Good afternoon, Ben began, his voice clear and amplified. No longer the reedy tone of an overwhelmed local lawyer, but the measured cadence of a man who had stared down a giant and won. Today, the court upheld a simple but profound truth. In America, the law is meant to protect speech, not to punish it. I want to thank Judge Weyer for her wisdom and her commitment to justice. I want to thank the thousands of people from all over the country who supported our client and his right to ask questions, and I want to express my profound professional and personal gratitude to my co-counsel, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who came to our aid when we needed it most and proved that a commitment to justice knows no state lines. He turned and gestured to Leo Schmidt, who stepped forward, blinking in the bright lights. The weeks of stress were still visible on his young face, but they were now overlaid with a new, hard-won confidence. He clutched a piece of paper, but after a glance at it, he folded it and put it in his pocket, deciding to speak from the heart. A month ago, I was pretty sure my life was over. Leo started, a nervous but genuine smile flickering on his lips. I thought I'd lose everything because I dared to look at public documents and report what I found. I was scared. But what this experience has taught me is that I was never really alone. He looked out at the crowd. This victory doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every person who sent $20 to the defense fund. It belongs to journalists like Julian Pace who believe in the truth. It belongs to lawyers like Ben Carter who take on the tough cases, and to leaders like Congresswoman Crockett who are willing to fight for people who don't have a voice. His own voice grew stronger, filled with purpose. The court has ordered Mr. Burgum's firm to pay my legal fees. That means the defense fund, the money you all so generously donated, is now a resource. So, today I'm announcing the formation of the Prairie Post Foundation for Local Reporting. We are going to use that money, not for me, but to provide grants and free legal support to other citizen journalists, bloggers, and small-town reporters across the country who are doing the vital work of holding local power accountable. We're going to make sure that the next time a powerful person tries to use their money to bully a reporter into silence, they won't be facing one scared kid. They'll be facing all of us. A wave of applause, loud and sustained, swept through the crowd. Leo had transformed his personal trauma into a public good. Finally, Jasmine Crockett stepped to the microphone. She let the applause for Leo die down, deliberately shifting the focus back to him. "There isn't much to add to that," she said, her voice warm and proud. "Leo Schmidt is what courage looks like. Ben Carter is what integrity looks like. This victory belongs to them, to the people of North Dakota, and to the U.S. Constitution. My role here was small, but my resolve is stronger than ever. This case has exposed a dangerous flaw in our legal system. SLAPP suits are a cancer on our democracy. That's why, when I return to Washington, I will be introducing a new piece of federal legislation to create strong, uniform anti-SLAPP protections for every American in every state. We're going to call it the Prairie Act." She looked at Leo, because the bravest voices often come from the quietest places. "Thank you." She didn't take questions, instead stepping back and putting a supportive arm around Leo's shoulders, making it clear that the day was his. Hours later, the chaos had subsided, replaced by the sterile calm of the Fargo Hector International Airport. In a small cafe near Gate 4, Crockett, Leo, and Ben sat around a small table with coffee cups. The adrenaline of the victory had given way to a shared, pleasant exhaustion. Her flight back to D.C. was boarding in 40 minutes. "I still can't believe it's real," Leo said, shaking his head as he stared into his cup. "This morning I woke up with a knot in my stomach the size of a softball. Now I'm the head of a foundation." "You earned it," Ben said, clapping him on the back. The older lawyer looked 10 years younger, his passion for his work reignited by a case that mattered. "I haven't felt this good about being a lawyer since I passed the bar." He looked at Crockett. "Thank you, Jasmine, for everything. You didn't just help us win a case. You reminded me why I wanted to do this job in the first place." "Did the work," Ben Crockett insisted. "You just needed a little backup. Now, the real work starts for you, Leo." She leaned forward, her expression turning serious, mentoring. "The money and the attention are great, but they can be a distraction. People will want to make you into a symbol, a talking head. Don't let them. The power of what you did wasn't in being famous, it was in the work. The boring, tedious, unglamorous work of reading documents and connecting dots. Stay focused on that. The truth is in the paperwork. Don't ever forget it." "I won't," Leo said, meeting her gaze. He finally knew how to put his gratitude into words. "You know, when you first showed up, I thought you were there to save me. But that's not what you did. You taught me how to fight for myself. I'll never be able to thank you enough for that." An announcement for her flight echoed through the terminal. Crockett stood up, briefcase in hand. "You just did," she said with a warm smile. "You call me if you need anything." Anything. At all. She shook Ben's hand and gave Leo a quick, firm hug. Then she turned and walked toward her gate, just another traveler in a gray pantsuit, leaving behind a new foundation and to men whose lives she had fundamentally changed. Ripple effects of the victory spread farther and faster than any of them could have imagined. For Doug Burgum and Alan Devlin, the consequences were swift and humiliating. The story of a federal judge sanctioning their firm for filing a frivolous lawsuit was a reputational stain that money couldn't wash away. Their largest institutional client, a pension fund that prided itself on its ethical governance standards, quietly terminated its 9-figure contract with Burgum's private equity firm, citing the negative public judgment. Burgum's carefully cultivated image as a statesman-like business guru was shattered, replaced by the caricature of a thin-skinned bully. His name was discreetly withdrawn from the list of keynote speakers at a major national economic conference. His political capital, for the time being, had vanished. In Washington, D.C., 3 weeks later, Jasmine Crockett stood on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. In her hand was H.R. 524, the Protecting Reporters and Inspiring Independent Expression Act, the Prairie Act. "Madam Speaker," she began, her voice carrying through the chamber, "I rise today to talk about a young man named Leo Schmidt from Fargo, North Dakota. Mr. Schmidt is not a wealthy man. He is not a powerful man. He is a citizen who did his civic duty. He read the public record and asked simple questions about how his government was spending public money. For that, he was targeted by a multi-million-dollar lawsuit designed to ruin him. A lawsuit designed to silence him. He was lucky. He had good counsel and a judge who saw the suit for what it was, an abuse of the judicial system." She told the whole story, her voice ringing with conviction. But how many Leo Schmidts are out there who are not so lucky? How many citizens, how many local journalists are silenced before they even publish, terrified by the threat of a lawsuit they cannot afford to fight? This is not a partisan issue. It is a constitutional issue. A free press is the immune system of democracy. SLAPP suits are a disease that weakens that immune system. The Prairie Act will create a strong federal standard to allow courts to quickly dismiss these baseless lawsuits and force those who file them to pay the price. It ensures that the First Amendment is not just a privilege for the powerful, but a right for all. An unlikely coalition of co-sponsors, ranging from progressive Democrats to libertarian-leaning Republicans, who saw the issue as one of government overreach and free speech, had already signed on. The fight would be long, but it had begun. The final, most enduring echo of the Fargo courtroom, however, was heard not in the halls of Congress or the boardrooms of the wealthy, but at a kitchen table in a small borough in eastern Pennsylvania. Her name was Carol Kowalski. She was 61 years old, a retired accountant who had lived in the same small house for 40 years. For the past year, she had been deeply troubled by the town council's dealings with a new waste management company that had been awarded a no-bid 20-year contract. The garbage rates had doubled, and a strange chemical smell sometimes drifted from the new landfill on the edge of town. She had tried asking questions at a town meeting and had been curtly dismissed by the council president. She felt powerless, intimidated, and alone. She had watched the Frontline episode on the Burgum case, captivated. She saw Leo Schmidt, a kid armed with nothing but a laptop and the facts, and she saw herself. She followed the news of the trial. And when she read about the dismissal and the creation of Leo's foundation, something inside her shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but a new feeling began to crowd it out: determination. A week later, Carol Kowalski sat at her own kitchen table. She had spent $50 of her pension check to register a domain name, the Schuylkill Scrutinizer. She'd used a simple template to create a blog that looked a lot like the Prairie. Post, simple black text, on a white background. It took her 3 days to write her first post, a detailed, fact-based summary of the town's contract with the waste company. At the end of the post, she listed 10 questions she believed the town council needed to answer. Her hands trembled as she hit the publish button. The story didn't end there. Carol spent the next week teaching herself how to file a public records request under Pennsylvania's right-to-know law. She sent it to the town manager's office, formally requesting all correspondence between the council and the waste management company for the past 2 years. The final scene is this. 3 weeks later, a large manila envelope arrives at Carol's house. It's from the town. Inside are 200 pages of emails and memos. Carol pours herself a cup of tea and sits down at her kitchen table. She begins to read, a highlighter pen in her hand. As she reads, a small, knowing smile touches her lips. She has no idea what she will find, but she knows, with an unshakable certainty that she hasn't felt in years, that she is no longer powerless, and she knows she is not alone. The echo from Fargo had arrived. What does it truly mean to speak truth to power in the digital age? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the people fighting for our democracy.